In the winter skies over Korea 1950, Soviet pilots laughed when they first saw it. A stubby silver jet with swept wings that looked too small to fight.
It flies, yes,
Amerikansky
but it is a beast to
Igrushka,
maintain.
one instructor sneered.
Still,
The
it is a
American
beautiful
toy.
machine, Comrade Instructor.
To the men of the 324th IAD, the MiG-15 was the undisputed apex of jet-age engineering. A sleek, predatory machine with the thrust to climb to 50,000 feet and the firepower to shred a B-29 in a single burst. When they heard the Americans were fielding something smaller, slower, and with a shorter nose, the contempt was instinctive. They think they can beat the MiG with that? A Soviet ace scoffed at Andong Airfield, shaking his head as the first reports filtered in. They must be desperate. The mockery was not mere bravado. It was conviction born of numbers and physics. The MiG-15 BIs could climb at nearly 50 meters per second. Its twin 23 meters and single 37mm cannon could erase a bomber formation with one pass. Soviet instructors lectured their North Korean trainees that the Americans had lost their touch, that their designers had traded raw power for comfort and glossy paint. They circulated performance charts showing how the MiG could outclimb, outgun, and out-accelerate any Western jet then in service. Even Western intelligence admitted that the MiG-15 had shocked NATO, forcing the hasty deployment of the new F-86. To the men flying out of Antung and Mukden, the Sabre's appearance was almost comic. Its intake looked fragile, its fuselage too slender to hold a serious engine. One Soviet engineer remarked that it looked half a fighter, half a sport plane. Soviet propaganda quickly adopted the tone. American aircraft were over-designed luxuries, optimized for peacetime production, not battlefield endurance. In the briefings before engagement, they were told the F-86 could not sustain high G-turns at altitude, and that its lighter armament, 6 50-caliber machine guns, would be ineffective against the armored MiG. The first encounters seemed to confirm this. In early November 1950, MiG-15s tore through UN bomber formations near the Yalu River, forcing the United States to suspend high-altitude daylight raids. Moscow was triumphant. "We have reached parity," declared a Soviet aviation officer in Pravda. "The era of American air superiority is over." The pilots at Andong celebrated by painting MiG silhouettes on the walls of their ready rooms, confident the Americans would soon retreat south of the 38th parallel. What none of them understood, not yet, was that the Americans had prepared for a different kind of war. The F-86 Sabre was not designed to win on paper. It was designed to win in system, in production lines, maintenance bays, and the unglamorous calculus of reliability. Beneath its compact frame lay the accumulated logic of a nation that had mastered industrial scale. The Soviet pilots saw a toy jet. They were looking at the embodiment of the U.S. industrial machine. Small, yes, but infinitely repeatable, repairable, and refined through the mathematics of mass production. The laughter in those frozen hangars would not last long. Within months, the same men who had mocked the toy would find themselves fighting for their lives against it, realizing too late that what they faced was not a fighter. It was a system. The logic behind Soviet confidence was not mere arrogance. It was the legacy of a design philosophy shaped by scarcity and survival. From the ruins of the Second World War, the Soviet aviation industry had emerged with a singular conviction. Simplicity is power. Every engineer at Mikoyan Gurevich's OKB-155 bureau, from Artem Mikoyan to Rostislav Belyakov, was trained in an industrial culture where elegance meant minimalism and output was measured in tons of aluminum saved per plane. When they designed the MiG-15, they built it for a world of limited precision tooling, intermittent fuel quality, and field maintenance by mechanics with frozen hands and primitive equipment. In that harsh calculus, the MiG was perfect, rugged, fast, and efficient. The Soviets had been studying captured German research since 1945, particularly the swept-wing theory of Dr. Alexander Lippisch and the Mi-262 jet. What they learned, they weaponized. The MiG-15's 35-degree sweep and high tailplane weren't aesthetic. They were deliberate distortions of airflow to maximize transonic stability. Its engine, the Klimov VK-1, was a near-direct copy of the British Rolls-Royce Nene that the British government, astonishingly, had licensed for sale to Moscow in 1946. Soviet engineers reverse-engineered the Nene in just 18 months and produced it in the thousands, giving the MiG an unmatched thrust-to-weight ratio for its time. From the Kremlin's perspective, this achievement was proof of parity. "We have equaled the West," one report from the Ministry of Aviation boasted in 1949. "Our engines are as strong, our wings as advanced, our aircraft as fast." To a system obsessed with symbolic equality, the MiG-15 was the ultimate validation. It was large, visible, and intimidating, traits that resonated with the Soviet aesthetic of power. By contrast, American design seemed indulgent, even decadent. The North American aviation F-86 Sabre appeared modest with its smaller frame and lower service ceiling. Soviet analysts pored over photographs of it and concluded, quite rationally within their framework, that it lacked both reach and punch. They noted its 50-caliber Browning machine guns, a relic of propeller-era thinking, they thought, and laughed. The MiG's 23mm and 37mm cannons, by comparison, fired explosive shells capable of dismembering a bomber with 2 hits. "Americans do not understand modern air combat," a Soviet engineer wrote in Aviatsiya I Kosmonautika in 1951. "They build aircraft as they build cars, comfortable and smooth but unfit for the storm." That last phrase captured the Soviet worldview perfectly. Their pilots were taught that victory came from vertical energy and high-altitude dominance, not from maneuvering duels or electronic aids. Theirs was a philosophy of austerity: fight high, dive fast, and fire once. The MiG-15 was the manifestation of that doctrine, forged in a command economy where every gram of metal had to justify itself to the 5-year plan. What they could not see, because no Soviet system could show it, was the invisible architecture behind the American fighter. The production logistics, precision machining tolerances, fuel consistency, and maintenance throughput that turned the F-86 from a single machine into an ecosystem. To the Soviet mind, the jet was the product. To the American mind, the jet was a node in a system. And so, when those small silver aircraft began appearing over the Yalu River in late 1950, Soviet pilots thought they were confronting a weaker machine. In truth, they were confronting an entirely different idea of what an air force could be. The Americans' advantage in Korea was not the F-86 itself. It was the invisible machinery that built, supplied, and sustained it. Soviet intelligence had photographed the Sabre on runways in Okinawa and Japan and noted its clean, tight lines, its relatively low mass. What they missed was that every rivet, every hydraulic actuator, every fuel line was born of a manufacturing culture that had reached levels of precision no planned economy could replicate. The Americans were not fighting with a fighter. They were fighting with an industrial nervous system. At the heart of the Sabre's invisible advantage was a paradox. It was a smaller aircraft with more performance locked into its structure than the larger, seemingly mightier MiG-15. The key lay in metallurgy and machining. The F-86's General Electric J-47 turbojet was not a mere copy of British design. It was the culmination of 1,000 iterative refinements conducted by GE's Lynn and Evendale plants. Each engine assembly accompanied by tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. American industry had achieved what Soviet factories could only approximate: interchangeable precision. A damaged J-47 could be swapped in hours. Soviet VK-1s, though powerful, were hand-fitted machines that often required an entire maintenance crew to tune each compressor stage. In Korea, that meant one Sabre could fly twice as many sorties per week as a MiG. Behind the fighter stood the production line, a living, breathing organism. North American aviation had 36,000 employees dedicated to the Sabre program by 1951. Subcontractors across Ohio, Kansas, and California could produce airframes, control systems, and canopy assemblies simultaneously, shipping them through a logistics network that had been perfected during World War II. The American genius was not to build better engines or prettier aircraft, but to standardize excellence until it became automatic. Every part a precision part, an Enotla engineer said in 1952. That statement was not a boast. It was a threat to any nation that believed in craftsmanship over systemization. Fuel logistics formed another layer of invisibility. The U.S. Air Force operated on JP-4, a kerosene blend refined in uniform batches across multiple refineries, ensuring consistent combustion and turbine reliability. Soviet MiGs, deployed from airfields in Manchuria, operated on variable-grade kerosene, often contaminated, often unfiltered. Each batch subtly altered engine performance. Over hundreds of hours, the difference compounded. Sabres retained thrust longer. Compressor blades eroded slower, and ignition stability remained near perfect. What Soviet pilots called luck in combat was in fact chemical consistency, industrial quality control at national scale. Then there was the maintenance cycle. In American doctrine, aircraft were designed to be modular, quick to repair, easy to disassemble, and resilient to minor defects. The F-86 was a flying extension of Detroit logic. Hydraulic lines were color-coded and standardized. Electrical systems used plug-in socket modules instead of soldered joints. Soviet mechanics at Antung, by contrast, were still cutting and bending lines by hand, often scavenging fittings from wrecked MiGs. For the Americans, downtime was a scheduled variable. For the Soviets, it was chaos. Even the supposed weakness of the Sabre's 50-caliber guns reflected industrial insight. The United States could manufacture millions of rounds per month with stable propellant characteristics, maintaining ballistic predictability across all theaters. The MiG's cannons, firing 23 and 37-meter shells, packed more explosive force but suffered from limited production capacity and inconsistent ballistics. In a duel fought at 600 miles per hour, repeatable precision mattered more than raw impact. American pilots could fire longer bursts, adjust via radar-assisted gun sights, and maintain accuracy shot after shot. The MiG could kill with one hit, but only if it hit. The true revelation was that the F-86's superiority did not depend on any single innovation. It was an emergent property of the entire American industrial ecosystem, thousands of firms, millions of workers, all synchronized by standards, tolerances, and data. Soviet pilots in the cockpits above the Yalu were facing the cumulative momentum of a society that had transformed production itself into a weapon. To the men who mocked the toy jet, this was invisible. To American planners at Wright-Patterson and Tinker Air Force Base, it was the point. The F-86 was not a miracle machine. It was the visible edge of an invisible empire of precision. And when that empire entered combat, it made a mockery of every metric the Soviets had trusted. The war in the air changed the moment the silver shapes of the F-86 Sabre appeared over the Yalu River. What had begun as a Soviet showcase of technological triumph was about to become a case study in systemic humiliation. The first confrontations in December 1950 were not clean duels. They were sudden, chaotic, and fast. Soviet pilots entered combat convinced of the MiG-15's superiority in altitude and climb rate. But within minutes of contact, that certainty began to erode. At 30,000 feet, the MiG held the theoretical advantage. It could climb faster, dive harder, and accelerate in a straight line. Yet when the fight turned horizontal, when angles replaced altitude, the Sabre began to dictate the engagement. The Americans called it energy fighting, a discipline built not on brute thrust but on the intelligent management of speed, altitude, and control. The F-86's hydraulically boosted ailerons allowed instantaneous role reversals at transonic speeds, where the MiG's mechanical controls began to stiffen. A Soviet ace later admitted, "I pulled, but the stick refused to move. The American rolled beneath me like water." The shock was visceral. Soviet pilots trained in steep climbs and diving strikes found themselves unable to sustain a turning fight. The Sabre's wing, designed with a leading-edge slat that deployed automatically, preserved lift at high angles of attack. It turned inside the MiG's arc without stalling, a mechanical miracle the Soviets mistook for witchcraft. In their combat debriefs, they called it the invisible hand. What they were seeing was the product of aerodynamic testing at Edwards Air Force Base, where thousands of wind tunnel hours had been converted into a piece of metal that could defy airflow itself. The guns told the rest of the story. While Soviet cannon rounds exploded beautifully in gun camera footage, they often missed. Their slow velocity and low rate of fire meant a fraction of a second's error translated into empty sky. American .50 caliber streams guided by the A-1C radar gun sight created invisible lattices of lead precisely where the MiG would be a second later. It was mathematics, not luck. When a Sabre opened fire, it wasn't guessing, it was calculating. In the skies above Sinuiju, equations were killing men. On paper, the MiG should have dominated. In the logbooks, it was the Sabre that owned the air. By 1952, the kill ratio stood at roughly 10-1 in favor of the F-86. Soviet pilots filed reports blaming pilot error, insufficient radio coordination, or fuel starvation. Few dared to admit the truth, that the American system was simply faster at learning. Every Sabre returned with flight data recorded, analyzed, and transmitted back to California within weeks. Engineers modified control trims, fuel pumps, even ammunition belts mid-campaign. The MiG remained static, a monument to design perfection that could not evolve. There was also the matter of endurance. While MiGs operated from bases deep in Manchuria limited by political boundaries, Sabres flew from forward airfields supported by fleets of tankers, mobile maintenance units, and radar stations. American pilots often returned to combat the same afternoon after rearming and refueling. Soviet pilots waited for spare parts, for orders, for the weather. In a system designed for central control, responsiveness died. In a system built for decentralization, adaptability thrived. By the spring of 1952, Soviet confidence was fracturing. In mess halls along the Yalu, pilots whispered about the golden jets that appeared out of the sun, fired once, and vanished. They stopped laughing at the Sabre's size. They began to dread its silence. The smaller machine had turned into a predator, fast, coordinated, relentless. The mockery that had filled the hangars of Antung had gone quiet. In its place was a question none dared to ask aloud. How could a smaller, simpler-looking aircraft defeat them so completely? The answer, though invisible from the cockpit, was embedded in every bolt and every supply crate that crossed the Pacific. America's true weapon was not the jet itself. It was the machinery of replication behind it. The revelation came not in a single battle, but in the cold arithmetic of the campaign's aftermath. Between 1950 and 1953, over the skies of Korea, 792 F-86 Sabres were deployed. Against them, the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans fielded nearly 1,500 MiG-15s. Yet by the armistice, the numbers told a story no ideology could erase. F-86 claimed 792 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 78 Sabres in air combat, a kill ratio exceeding 10.1, later confirmed even by declassified Soviet reports that privately admitted to catastrophic losses. To the engineers in Moscow, this ratio was incomprehensible. The MiG-15B's was on paper the superior machine. It climbed faster, it reached higher altitudes, and its cannons carried explosive power that should have shredded the Sabre's thin aluminum skin. But numbers on paper had betrayed them because the American strength did not exist in the aircraft. It existed in the network that sustained it. Consider sortie endurance. An F-86 averaged 120 combat sorties per airframe before major overhaul. A MiG-15 averaged 35. The reason was brutally simple. American manufacturing produced parts that fit perfectly time after time. Maintenance manuals were standardized across all squadrons. Each field depot had identical toolkits and color-coded parts bins. The same could not be said for the Soviets, whose MiGs were hand-fitted at Gaz-21 and Gaz-153. Parts from one factory often refused to mate with assemblies from another. Soviet mechanics spent hours grinding and adjusting airframes that were, in theory, identical. The difference wasn't craftsmanship, it was repeatability, and repeatability wins wars. Engine reliability showed the same pattern. The General Electric J47 GE27 engine had a mean time between overhaul MTBO of 180 flight hours. The Soviet VK-1's MTBO rarely exceeded 60. That meant that every Soviet squadron required 3 engines to keep one aircraft operational. Fuel contamination and compressor wear, combined with logistical inefficiency, further reduced flight readiness. The U.S. Air Force could launch 85% of its Sabres daily. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps rarely exceeded 50% operational readiness. In the calculus of attrition, that difference was decisive. Ammunition logistics mirrored the pattern. The U.S. could ship millions of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weekly via Japan's Yokosuka docks, each batch precisely identical in propellant chemistry and ballistics. Soviet supply through Dalian and Mukden relied on overland transport and inconsistent ordnance batches, often from separate factories. Gun jams and misfires were common in MiGs at high altitude, while Sabres fired continuously without malfunction. The toy jet could shoot longer, more often, and with mathematical predictability. Training pipelines exposed an even deeper structural divide. Between 1950 and 1953, the U.S. trained over 5,000 jet-qualified pilots. The Soviet Union trained fewer than 800 for deployment to Korea. Most rotated in secret under the codename Volunteer 64th IAK. American pilots averaged 450 flight hours before deployment. Soviet pilots averaged 120. Worse, Soviet training was designed for idealized conditions. Formation intercepts, not dynamic energy combat. The U.S., by contrast, ran live simulation programs at Nellis Air Force Base where dogfight data from Korea were reenacted and disseminated within weeks. Every Sabre that fought made the next one deadlier. The MiG remained frozen in time. Even replacement logistics underscored the asymmetry of industrial systems. North American aviation could deliver a complete F-86 from its Inglewood plant every 15 hours by 1952. Replacement airframes arrived in Korea faster than the Soviets could ship spare parts. America's supply chain operated as an organism. The Soviet chain functioned as a command hierarchy. When a Sabre was damaged, it was patched and returned to combat in 48 hours. When a MiG was damaged, it was often cannibalized for parts. The psychological effect of these statistics was devastating. Captured Soviet pilots, recorded in U.S. interrogation transcripts declassified decades later, spoke not of fear but of confusion. "Your planes never stop coming," one said in disbelief. "We kill one, and by the next morning there are more." To him it seemed supernatural. To American strategists it was logistics, the cold precision of a system designed for infinite replacement. Even aerial tactics reflected industrial philosophy. The Sabre's air radar, the AN/APG-30, could be serviced in the field with modular components. The MiG's gun sight was mechanical and required calibration by factory specialists. Americans treated electronics as consumables. Soviets treated them as heirlooms. The result was that the Sabre could adapt its electronics mid-campaign, while MiGs flew with faults that no one dared to repair. In the grand totals of history, these figures appear sterile, but in the freezing air over Korea, they translated into life and death. Every maintenance cycle, every engine hour, every spare crate that crossed the Pacific was a silent reinforcement of American dominance. It wasn't that the Sabre was perfect. It was that the American system could afford imperfection, correct it instantly, and scale the correction. By 1953, the Soviets were no longer asking how the Americans built a better jet. They were asking how the Americans built an empire of production that turned even mediocrity into mastery. The answer lay in the warehouses, the machine shops, and the assembly lines that never slept. In that arithmetic of war, ideology meant nothing. The numbers spoke the truth, and they spoke American. By mid-1952, the laughter had died. Soviet pilots who had once toasted the invincible MiG now carried a quiet dread into every sortie over the Yalu. The myth of superiority, the belief that socialist design purity could outfight capitalist excess, was disintegrating in the cold, thin air of northern Korea. The F-86 Sabre had become more than a machine. It was a mirror held up to the Soviet system itself, reflecting every hidden flaw of its industrial ideology. In debriefing rooms at Antung, political officers struggled to explain the mounting losses. The official narrative spoke of numerical imbalance or weather conditions, but among the pilots, a different truth circulated in whispers. "The Americans repair their planes before we even land," one lieutenant murmured after a mission in which 3 MiGs were lost and none returned. Damaged Sabres were still flying the next morning. What he didn't know was that this was not exaggeration. On the U.S. side, mobile maintenance units worked around the clock under floodlights, drawing from standardized toolkits and crates flown in daily from Japan. A Sabre hit in the wing could be patched in 4 hours. A MiG with similar damage might sit grounded for weeks, awaiting a part from Gaz-21 5,000 kilometers away. The ideological foundations of Soviet aviation, faith in simplicity, distrust of complexity, glorification of the individual craftsman, collapsed under the weight of this systemic precision. American complexity worked because it was industrialized. It did not depend on genius, but on process. The Soviets, who had built their air doctrine around the myth of heroic improvisation, could not comprehend a system where even improvisation was automated. Psychological strain mounted. Pilots began refusing to engage Sabres unless ordered. One after-action report from the 196th Regiment, now declassified, records, "Morale deteriorating due to invisible enemy advantage. F-86 appears to anticipate maneuver before execution." The phrase invisible enemy advantage captured the helplessness perfectly. Soviet pilots were not being outflown, they were being outsystemed. Every time they entered combat, they were facing a weapon that learned faster than any human opponent. The collapse was not confined to the skies. In Moscow, committees debated whether American radar gun sights violated socialist principles of pilot autonomy. In truth, the gun sight was not a betrayal of skill, it was an integration of machine precision into human reflex. The Americans had accepted that technology could enhance man. The Soviets still believed technology must serve as a humble assistant. The result was ideological paralysis. Captured documents later revealed the private despair of Soviet engineers. One MiG designer wrote in his journal, "Our fighters are masterpieces, but they are orphans, each born alone. Theirs are legion." It was an admission that the American system's strength lay not in the brilliance of any single aircraft, but in the mass synchronization of production, maintenance, and adaptation. A machine ecosystem that embodied capitalism's most terrifying virtue: scalability. Even propaganda could not conceal the psychological rot. By 1953, Soviet broadcasts had shifted tone from triumph to endurance. The MiG pilots defend the socialist sky with valor. The subtext was unmistakable. Valor had replaced victory as the metric of success. In the West, by contrast, the Sabre became a symbol of effortless supremacy, its sleek frame photographed against clouds, the American eagle reborn in metal and thrust. The ideological collapse reached its quiet conclusion not in combat but in resignation. Soviet air doctrine after Korea abandoned the claim of qualitative superiority. The new goal was quantitative equivalence, building more aircraft faster, not better. The lesson was bitter. Industrial abundance, not design purity, determined air power. For the men who had once mocked the toy jet, that realization was devastating. They had not merely lost an air war, they had lost a world view. The F-86 had done what no propaganda could. It had shown that America's true weapon was not its technology, but its ability to turn industry into instinct. When the Korean armistice was signed in July 1953, the war in the air ended. But the industrial war it had revealed was only beginning. The F-86 Sabre's triumph over the MiG-15 was not just a tactical or technological event. It was a strategic revelation that reshaped the doctrines of both superpowers. What the Americans understood and the Soviets were forced to learn was that modern air supremacy no longer depended on the brilliance of a design bureau. It depended on the capacity of a civilization to mass-produce precision. In Washington and Dayton, the lessons of the Sabre were codified into the next generation of American fighters. The Century Series jets, the F-100 Super Sabre, F-101 Voodoo, F-102 Delta Dagger, were all designed around the same core idea: standardization as strategy. Every component, from radar modules to hydraulic actuators, had to be replaceable in the field and upgradable across variants. The Air Force no longer thought in terms of planes, it thought in terms of platforms, industrial organisms that could evolve with technology. This was the Sabre's true legacy. It taught America to weaponize its industrial metabolism. The same system that had produced refrigerators, automobiles, and television sets now produced jet engines, radar transceivers, and guided munitions, each rolling off the same types of automated assembly lines. The line between civilian industry and military innovation blurred completely. A mechanic in Detroit and an engineer in California were now both soldiers in the same invisible war. For the Soviet Union, the lesson was harsher. The MiG-15's defeat forced a doctrinal shift away from the cult of design genius toward the desperate pursuit of parity through numbers. The result was the MiG-17 and later the MiG-19, aircraft faster, heavier, and built in staggering quantities, yet haunted by the same structural inefficiency. The Soviets had learned that their designers could build brilliance, but their factories could not sustain it. Each airframe still required human intervention, adjustment, and adaptation. The American jet remained a product of processes, the Soviet jet a product of labor. Strategically, the Korean experience hardened the U.S. conviction that industrial scale was the final guarantor of victory. It informed Eisenhower's New Look policy, emphasizing nuclear deterrence backed by a military-industrial complex capable of infinite mobilization. The phrase itself, military-industrial complex, was not a warning yet. It was a point of pride, the conscious fusion of America's factories and its foreign policy. The F-86 had proven that industry could act faster than ideology, and from that point on, the United States would treat industrial innovation as a national defense imperative. In NATO, the Sabre became legend. European air forces from Britain to West Germany adopted it not merely for its combat record but as a symbol of Western production discipline. Pilots from the Royal Air Force, Luftwaffe, and the Royal Canadian Air Force trained on it, discovering that its maintenance manuals were clearer, its components easier to replace, and its performance astonishingly consistent. It was not just a fighter, it was a philosophy of control, modularity, and trust in the system. The Soviets too absorbed the lesson, reluctantly, grimly. They began pouring resources into production automation, creating massive industrial zones in the Urals and beyond. But their command structure could never replicate America's distributed genius. Centralization strangled adaptation. Bureaucracy turned speed into inertia. By the time the MiG-21 entered service in the late 1950s, the Americans had already moved beyond mechanical flight into electronic warfare and guided missiles. The cycle had begun anew, and the Soviet Union was, again, a step behind. Thus, the air war over Korea did more than decide tactical superiority. It established the industrial dialectic of the Cold War. American abundance versus Soviet austerity, mass standardization versus artisanal constraint. The F-86 Sabre was not just an aircraft. It was the physical proof that democracy, armed with production discipline, could outfly totalitarian precision. In the decades that followed, even the Soviets would quietly concede what had happened over the Yalu. Behind closed doors at Zhukovsky Air Force Academy, instructors teaching the next generation of pilots no longer spoke of the MiG-15 as an unblemished triumph. They called Korea Urok Smirenija, the lesson in humility. The phrase was deliberate, almost ritualistic, and it carried an undertone of reluctant respect. For the first time in the jet age, the Soviet Union had confronted not just an enemy air force, but an enemy civilization whose entire industrial rhythm was faster, more disciplined, and more adaptive than its own. Years later, a former MiG-15 pilot, Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyaev, one of the war's top aces, summed it up bluntly. The Americans were not stronger because of their planes. They were stronger because they could make 1,000 of them all the same. His words captured the essence of the war's hidden outcome. The F-86 Sabre's true victory was not the 10-1 kill ratio, it was the annihilation of an illusion. It proved that in the modern age, genius without mass, design without depth, and courage without infrastructure were nothing but poetry against the calculus of industry. In its silver skin gleamed a doctrine that would define the next 30 years, that no rival could match the United States unless it first matched the scale of its systems. The Sabre's legacy lived on not just in the jets that followed, but in every Cold War confrontation where production, logistics, and standardization decided outcomes long before the first shot was fired. From Vietnam's supply networks to the space race's assembly lines, the Soviets had once laughed at the tiny American jet. They stopped laughing when they realized it was not tiny at all. It was enormous, the airborne tip of an industrial colossus that spanned continents. Every rivet on its fuselage was a data point in a vast national equation. Every sortie, a demonstration of what happens when a society turns manufacturing into strategy. In the end, the F-86 did not merely dominate Korea. It redefined the very idea of air power. Where the MiG-15 was the masterpiece of a workshop, the Sabre was the masterpiece of a system, and systems once set in motion cannot be shot down.